Hey, it's Michael Douglas. Welcome back to another edition of Dr. Pundit, where we talk about music, not medicine. And a couple of shows back, or maybe a couple of weeks ago, I did a video on the making of, or the genesis of the Revolver album by the Beatles. It was my brief take on this album, which is a very important album in their catalog, obviously. And this is coming from a largely Beatles non fan, but somebody who is much more enamored of the history surrounding the band and the aura surrounding the band than basically, listening to her music, which is, I think there's a place for that as well. And this show today, I'll be focusing on this album again with five little known facts on its evolution and recording process. And, the Beatles turned the studio into basically a lethal weapon in their 1966 recording of the seminal album Revolver. And George Martin, the producer, and the four men in the group went to great lengths to create sounds that basically tore down the boundaries of fantastic pop music. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album is the only other album I can think of from that period that had as much of a music evolutionary shift within the mid 1960s from that point onward. So, yeah, Revolver is a very important album in that regard. And I would hasten to say that the music from this album is endlessly compelling. I mean, people still, of course, write about this album almost 60 years later. It's incredible. And so some of the stories are as well behind the making of this album. And there are five that I like to share with you. So the first one is about John Lennon's infamous laziness. He gained a reputation as someone who loved, power naps. They didn't call them power naps back then, but you get the gist. He wrote about it in Revolver in the song I'm Only Sleeping, which defended his right to sleep away even in his waking hours. His penchant for sawing songs led to one of the most momentous songs on the record, and one that is referred to often when critically discussing this album. And Paul McCartney arrived at John Lennon's abode one day and wanted to do kind of a writing session. He had to wait a bit, however, because John Lennon was sleeping in when Paul arrived. And to make the most of the time, he settled out Paul McCartney at the swimming pool. And by the time John Lennon awoke, Paul McCartney had pretty much written the gorgeous ballad from that album called Here, There, and Everywhere. It's kind of a little known story there. We tend to think of Yellow Submarine as the ultimate kid song. The fact that it was turned into a well-regarded animated movie certainly plays into that. But when it began, it was something much different. A recent reissue of the album Revolver included some of the working tapes for the various songs on the album. And on that release, you can hear John Lennon singing those downcast lyrics to the main melody of the verses. In the place where I was born, no one cared, no one cared. Now that's a far cry from the finished version, of course, where Ringo sings of the wonders of the ocean blue, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney make these kind of aquatic noises. Whenever the Beatles came back to America, everybody wanted to have an audience with them. That included other rock stars and Hollywood celebrities. And at one point, while taking a breather during a break in California in 1965, the band threw a party at the house where they were staying. And during that party, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr all took LSD. Harrison had a, somewhat adverse reaction during his trip. He believed at one point he was dead. Actor Peter Fonda, perhaps channeling his future role in 4 years later in Easy Rider, who attended the party, tried to comfort Harrison by basically telling him he had lived through a near-death experience as a child. John Lennon made the incident the basis of the lyrics to the song She Said, She Said, which I really haven't heard that much of. Now, during that same party that inspired the song She Said, She Said, all the Beatles took LSD, except for Paul McCartney, famously so. He was the last holdout, worrying that the drug would somehow alter his perception to the point to where it would negatively affect his songwriting. Of course, it was just as famous that he would eventually relent to taking LSD. But Paul McCartney was no such holdout when it came to pot. Now, on the surface, the song Got to Get You Into My Life, which was actually released as a radio single some 11 years later in the mid 1970s, hitting the top 10, and then redone by Earth, Wind, and Fire, seems like an homage to a special companion, special girl. But Paul McCartney admitted after the fact that he was actually singing to the praises of Pot, and this is also well known, in this song, Got to Get You Into My Life, knowing that lines like another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind there. When you hear that, another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind there, suddenly makes a lot of sense. Finally, John Lennon as the llama. The Uber producer, George Martin, had a prime gig in one sense. He was on hand to produce some of the most perfectly constructed pop songs in history, of course, but you also have to consider that he faced a lot of pressures. And after all, George Martin was expected to translate the Beatles' various musical requests, some of which pushed the realms of possibility. And in the case like the song Tomorrow Never Knows, John Lennon believed that the lyrics to that song should sound like they were being chanted from a mountain by none other than the Dalai Lama. Now, Martin and engineer Geoff Emerick helped to make this happen by running through his vocals through a Leslie speaker. Now, a Leslie speaker is an apparatus that basically turned vocals that were running through it into kind of a rotating cabinet sound. And a Leslie's tone is uniquely defined by its cabinet design and its construction, the amplifier and whatnot, not by merely the spinning of rotors. And it's kind of technical and that kind of thing, but it amplifies the sound in that respect. So that's kind of, I actually, didn't know that story until I researched the story for this video today. So I thought that was fairly interesting. So 5, some facts well known more than others during the Revolver sessions by the Beatles. And again, I'm fascinated by this band. I do like some of their songs, but I don't think you have to be a total, huge lover of their music to get into the band. I mean, they just had that aura in which musicologists study the band and their rise and their subsequent importance to popular music within the past 100 years. If they're not at the top, they're pretty darn close. I'm Michael Douglas, and if you like what you see here in the video, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And as a late great Barry White always used to say, let the music play, and I'll see you on the next episode.